You have exactly 3 seconds to like and subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, I'll appear in your dreams tonight. To ask for a donation for that cup of coffee, link below.
Let's go back to 1950. This is South Korea. And this is the Republic of Vietnam. Both regimes were products of the Cold War, a period when the US and the Soviet Union continuously established and supported pro-government regimes, as well as conducting proxy wars in many parts of the world. During this period, both South Korea and the Republic of Vietnam shared a commonality: they relied entirely on US aid. However, by 1975, the US gradually reduced aid to the Republic of Vietnam, while shifting resources to continue supporting South Korea. As a result, the Republic of Vietnam was devastated, while South Korea continued to develop and became one of the strongest economies in Asia. But why was that? Let's recall the historical context and compare the US aid strategy for both countries. Why did the US need to provide aid to the Republic of Vietnam first and most important? The US justified its intervention in Vietnam with the domino, which states that if a country falls under the influence of communism, other countries will follow. Neighboring countries would immediately rise up, and the US would face the risk of losing allies. Simultaneously, communist ideology could become more attractive, weakening its leadership role in the free world. The main goal of the US was to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia in particular and Asia in general. The US heavily invested in building the image of the Republic of Vietnam as a developing and stable nation. This aimed to convince other countries of the benefits of cooperating with the US instead of pursuing the Soviet model. Success in Vietnam not only strengthened the US position in Southeast Asia but also sent a clear message to allies and adversaries that the US was determined to prevent the spread of communism globally, especially in developing countries. To achieve this, the US needed to make efforts to build and strengthen a stable and effective government in South Vietnam. This necessitated investment in developing social and educational infrastructure to create a foundation. It was crucial for the Republic of Vietnam to stand on its own 2 feet and develop independently. With the second instance of direct US military support during the occupation, it's undeniable that American capital also repeatedly eyed the resources in Vietnam. An editorial in the New York Times on February 12 wrote, "The East Asian region is a tempting target for us to gamble on. It could be used to export tin, coal, wood, rice, rubber, coconut, pepper, and other commodities. But the US didn't keep all these mineral resources for itself. It also supplied these commodities to the industries and consumers of important allied countries like Britain, France, Japan, and West. Each country had different needs. While Britain and Germany needed these resources for industrial development, France and Japan needed them for post-war economic reconstruction. Therefore, the New York Times, in its issue, further affirmed that trade in products from Southeast Asia were not essential to the US, but were very important to us and our allies. In other words, Vietnam was something the Americans needed to seize to consolidate their power in the context of the Cold War tensions. In his speech on August 4, 1950, US President Eisenhower also said that if we lost in the large quantities of tin and V-fram that we valued so highly would no longer be within reach. Speaking specifically about V-fram, according to data from the US Geological Survey, Vietnam, 3rd highest V-fram reserves in the world, after Russia and China. With such calculation, the US requested Ngo Dinh Diem to sign a preferential investment agreement called the Vietnam-US Economic and Cooperation Treaty. In this treaty, Ngo guaranteed favorable conditions for American investors in all economic sectors and promised not to nationalize key enterprises for a long time. What about South Korea? The reason for the US aid to South Korea was similar to the reasons for aid to South Vietnam after the South Korea became an important outpost in the US strategy to prevent the spread of communism in East Asia. Furthermore, after the war, South fell into a difficult economic situation, with its infrastructure destroyed and lacking natural resources. Helping South Korea rebuild and develop not only benefited the country but also strengthened the US position in the region by creating a strong economic and political ally. But specifically, how much aid did the US provide to South Vietnam and Korea? To get an overview, let's compare the amount of economic aid that South Vietnam and South Korea received from the US in separate periods. First, during this period, South Korea received between $200 and $300 million in aid from the US each year for the first 3 years. South Vietnam also received a similar amount of aid from 1958 onwards. South Vietnam's aid decreased to approximately $200 million in the period from 1961. This period marked the rise of the Chinese Communist Party and the desire to reduce US influence over Korea. The US ceased military aid and reduced the number of troops stationed there. The US-Korea aid receive relationship from 1948 to 1961 gradually shifted to a loan model. South Vietnam, however, was different. After President Kennedy took office due to changes in the battlefield and political landscape of Vietnam, the US needed even more economic aid. Therefore, the figures also changed significantly. Onwards, the US reduced aid to South Korea to less than $200 million per year, then to around $100 million, and continued to decrease for South Vietnam. In 1960, this figure was $150 million per year. However, from 1960, after the coup that overthrew the Nung Ngo Diem government, aid began to increase again, from $1 in 1963 to in 1966, 74. U.S. economic aid to South Vietnam consistently ranged from $500 to $700 million, reaching $240 million by April 19. Aid to South Vietnam increased significantly compared to South Korea, especially as the war in Vietnam entered a tense phase. According to a world scientific document from 1950, South received over $4 billion from the U.S., then gradually decreased. South Viet, on the other hand, received a total of over $26 billion in aid from the U.S., including $10 billion in economic aid and $16 billion in military aid. So, despite all the enormous sums of money given to both Vietnam and did the U.S. achieve its goals? We need to discuss how both South Vietnam and South Korea used aid. Used aid from the U.S. to invest in and social reform. Although in the early post-war period, USA did not bring immediate economic improvements, it laid a solid foundation for later development. Many Koreans were trained in the U.S. in important fields, such as economics and engineering. These individuals later became experts, leaders, making significant contributions to the country's economic development. And 1970s, the entire economic landscape of South Korea underwent a transformation. The role of the Japanese conglomerates cannot be overlooked. After coming to power, North Korea implemented outward-oriented economic policies, focusing on exports and the development of heavy industries. He utilized U.S. aid to support the development of conglomerates, such as Hyundai, Samsung, and S, while simultaneously implementing special protectionist policies. Preferential loans and tax breaks laid the foundation for economic growth. Many founders and leaders of these companies were trained in the U.S. or participated in U.S.-funded training programs, equipping them with advanced management and technological skills, thereby contributing to the development of these industries in many industrial period. According to World Bank, South Korea's GDP in 1960 was only. However, by 1980, the country's GDP had exceeded $100 billion for the first time and continued to grow strongly. The poverty rate decreased sharply from around 40–50% in the 1950s to below 5% in the 1990s. Along with that, the literacy rate increased to 100% by the end of the 1980s thanks to strong investment in education. In contrast, the Republic of Vietnam, despite receiving many times more aid, did not achieve the same successes. South. The first thing to mention is its complete dependence on foreign aid. The entire Republic of Vietnam relied on aid from the United States. This aid not only provided financial support to maintain government operations, but also assisted in the development of agricultural infrastructure and other sectors. However, dependence on imports, especially essential goods and industrial products, prevented the Republic of Vietnam from developing a self-sufficient economy. According to the CIA, the economic policies of the Republic of Vietnam mainly focused on responding to the short-term consequences of the war, neglecting sustainable development and economic self-reliance. The publication Public Opinion on September 1 warned that the Vietnamese people would face a tragedy: the inability to feed themselves, relying solely on imported rice and other goods. It feared that one day, due to the struggle for food and clothing, they would be driven to the point of self-destruction, becoming a second nation. This was a serious and persistent problem in the Republic of Vietnam. The large war expenditures of both the Republic of Vietnam and the U.S. governments drove up consumer demand. But the supply of goods remained insufficient. Inadequate goods and services led to inflation, forcing the South Vietnamese government to rely heavily on imports, funded by the U.S. to keep inflation from escalating. However, made South Vietnam even more dependent on aid, specifically in the cost of living in South Vietnam had increased by more than 125%. Figure the U.S. predicted would rise many times over. The final reason for the failure of South Vietnam was poor management. Weaknesses in the administrative and management structure hindered the effective implementation of economic policies. Specific, the South Vietnamese government completely lacked experienced and decisive leaders. Thang Duc often relied on loyalty rather than competence. Corruption and internal political factors also reduced South Vietnam's economic self-reliance. When discussing the situation in Vietnam at that time, even U.S. officials were disheartened. Frank, former U.S. Senator, once said, "We were equipped. While the U.S. provided weapons to South Vietnam, they only knew how to flee." What? Another senator had to admit that Vietnam was the worst adventure in U.S. foreign. As a result, when the Paris Agreement was signed in January 1973 and the U.S. withdrew its troops from Vietnam, aid to South Vietnam was immediately and fundamentally cut off. The South Vietnamese economy quickly fell into a severe 3 alone. Agricultural production decreased by 20%. Numerous factories had to close due to scarce and high-priced raw materials. 1,000 people living on U.S. salaries lost their income. Plus, 2 million people became unemployed. The number of people eating in Saigon doubled compared to previous years. Inflation increased at a dizzying rate, and the economy further collapsed. The clearest evidence of the complete dependence on the U.S. is the average per capita income of South Vietnam, which you can observe on the screen. This decline was directly proportional to the decrease in U.S. aid. Carter at Grill University pointed out that the Republic of Vietnam was merely a fictional state. The Saigon regime could not sustain itself, not even generating enough revenue for its daily operations. It had to depend on American aid. But was the problem solely from the Republic of Vietnam's side? Or were there hidden internal conflicts and changes within the U.S. itself? To understand this more deeply, you need to understand the Nixon Doctrine. This was a foreign policy of the U.S. government, announced by President Richard Nixon in 1969, in which the U.S. would support its allies with economic and military aid, instead of direct military intervention. Nixon stated that the U.S. was not capable of protecting its allies and expected them to be more proactive. Nixon created this doctrine because the Vietnam War was draining all of the uses. Therefore, with strong public pressure and widespread protests against this doctrine served as a lifeline for the U.S. to withdraw from the conflict. The inability to withdraw fighting forces from Vietnam did not mean he was abandoning the Republic of Vietnam. Nixon's Vietnam War strategy, born from the idea of using Vietnamese to fight Vietnamese, reduced the sacrifices of the American army. In other words, American military aid to the Republic of Vietnam would decrease. But this very haste stifled the Saigon government. Public pressure forced the U.S. to provide, but it could not guarantee that the Republic of Vietnam would have enough time to consolidate its strength. Therefore, despite the U.S. invested heavily in training and equipping this force, it still faced many difficulties in standing on its own and confronting the liberation. Specific. Nixon gradually reduced the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam in several states, from a peak of to 69,000 in 1970. As a result, the Republic of Vietnam collapsed in 1975. So what did the U.S. receive in return from these two massive aid packages? Negative music. With South Korea, the U.S. has everything. First, it's a solid anti-communist ally, while simultaneously building the image of the U.S. as a nation capable of supporting and developing its allies. Furthermore, South Korea has become a potential economic market for the U.S. South Korea's economic development has created many opportunities for trade and investment cooperation for American companies. The total value of trade between the U.S. and South Korea in 2022 reached approximately figure missing. South Korea became seventh largest trading partner of the U.S. This economic cooperation originated in the years after the Korean War, when the U.S. supported South Korea's economic recovery. More importantly, the U.S. maintained a large military force in South Korea since Korea, with approximately 2,500 U.S. troops stationed at military bases throughout South Korea. This military presence not only helps the U.S. protect South Korea from threats from North Korea, but also strengthens U.S. influence in the region. In contrast to South Korea, the U.S. lost everything. President Duong Van Min of the Saigon government declared unconditional surrender to the Liberation Army. Despite strong military, economic, and political support, the regime still collapsed. The demise of the Republic of Vietnam was considered a major failure in the U.S. strategy in Southeast Asia. It can be said that the U.S. reduced aid to the Republic of Vietnam and focused on supporting South Korea was a strategic decision based on economic, political, and military factors. As the Vietnam War became increasingly costly and controversial within the U.S., South demonstrated its self-reliance, strong economic development, and became a reliable strategic ally of the U.S. in East Asia. Maintaining support for South Korea instead of the Republic of Vietnam reflected a shift towards partners with greater long-term potential and strategic value in the context of the Cold War. Therefore, it is not surprising that the U.S. later abandoned aid to the Republic of Vietnam to focus on supporting South Korea.